Tonight, we begin with something pleasantly slow. Not dragons or battles, thank goodness, but rather something more restful, the gentle, scratchy reality of staying alive in the medieval countryside. There were no wellness blogs or sleep apps, just a peasant, a goat, and a wool blanket that smelled suspiciously like a damp hedge. Now, if you'd like, dim the lights. Let your limbs go heavy, and as your pillow finds the shape of your head, allow yourself to slip quietly into a place where people boiled weeds on purpose and called it dinner. Yes, it's time to learn how medieval folks made it through the kind of days that would send modern humans screaming into customer service chat boxes. Close your eyes, now if you'd like. Let me tell you how it all began with a bed that wasn't really a bed. It was still dark when Oswin woke up. Not mysterious, magical dark, just stubborn, muddy, pre-dawn dark. The kind of dark that seeps into your bones and makes your elbows feel like soggy wood. The kind of dark that clings to the ceiling like mold with ambition. It wasn't night anymore exactly, but the morning hadn't worked up the nerve to begin. Oswin lay on his pallet, which was technically straw, but felt more like a collection of bushly-shaved broom handles. Above him, the roof dripped. This was its usual habit after it rained, and even on days when it hadn't. Rain was less of a cause and more of an accessory. His blanket had once been a sheep. Now it was a sort of pelt-like suggestion of comfort, patchy and coarse-smelling, faintly of ash smoke and onions. No one knew why. He shared it with a cousin, 3 fleas, and an idea of warmth that never fully committed. The room, if it could be called that, was part kitchen, part stable, and part draught. There was a window, but it mostly let in questions about insulation. The floor was dirt, although it had dreams of becoming mud. Every so often, it succeeded. Oswin sat up slowly, the way people do when their back protests like a medieval union. He reached for his shoes, which had not moved. They never did. In fact, they might have grown roots. Pulling them on felt like trying to argue with 2 particularly stubborn turnips. By the hearth, a word that here meant stone pile that sometimes smoked. His uncle Grifflet was already awake, poking the ashes like they owed him money. "You're up," Grifflet said, not quite with admiration. "It's either that or stay horizontal until my spine becomes folklore," Oswin replied. This was considered witty. At least, no one threw a radish at him. The first survival technique of the day, though Oswin wouldn't have called it that, was the layering method of marginal warmth. One tunic went over the other. A belt was tied twice once for function, once for superstition. Wool socks, if available, were rotated weekly like crop fields. Second was the hot stone trick, which involved heating a rock in the fire until it was a chai of volcanic, and then pretending it helped. It didn't really, but it gave your hands something to do while you contemplated mortality. Third came the soup that wasn't soup. Oswin's family called it pottage, but that was generous. It was more of a warm vegetable tea that had once glanced at a turnip. Still, it was warm, which was enough. You slurped it from a shared wooden bowl and hoped the chunk you bit into wasn't a splinter. Outside, the air had the consistency of wet wool. Oswin stepped into the yard, which was technically a space between the house and the goat. The goat Mags blinked at him with ancient disapproval. "You going to milk me, or just stand there, pretending you have thoughts?" her eyes seemed to say. Oswin sighed and began the daily ritual, known as the milking that took longer than it should. Mags was not generous with her time, and her patience had long since migrated to warmer climates. But eventually, a cup's worth of milk was acquired, strained through a cloth that once doubled as someone's hat. Breakfast was therefore complete, warm broth, stubborn milk, and half a heel of rye bread, so tough it could be used as fencing material in a pinch. Now I know what you're thinking. Surely there must be more to this tale. And you're right. But like all good stories told in the dark, this one unfolds slowly, like cold fingers learning to bend again. Survival wasn't a moment. It was a process repeated every day until it blurred into ritual. And so Oswin would now begin his daily chores, none of which involved electricity deadlines or decent shoes, just mud moss and occasionally some surprising forms of cheese. But that's for another stage. For now, take comfort in the simplicity. The pottage may have been watery. The blanket may have been judgmental, but somehow, in this land of leaky roofs and suspicious goats, people survived. And if they could do it, perhaps, just perhaps you can too. The morning air tasted like regret. Cold, persistent, and entirely uninterested in Oswin's personal comfort, it slithered through every crack in the wall, every gap in the wood, and every poorly stitched seam in his tunic. He wrapped the wool cloak tighter around his shoulders, not because it helped, but because it made him feel slightly less like a beetroot left too long in the frost. The first task of the day, as dictated by ancestral mumbling and a general desire not to perish, was collecting kindling. Firewood was the currency of survival, and in Oswin's case, it was mostly twigs, bark, and the occasional splintery disappointment that might burn if coaxed with enough pleading. The forest edge was a short walk away, or a long one, depending on how recently your shoes had developed holes. Oswin's had reached a state of disrepair where one could argue they were more philosophy than footwear. Still, he trudged forward, each step squelching in the frost-softened earth, accompanied by the rhythmic swish of his tunic brushing against his legs, like a very lazy broom. Upon reaching the edge of the woods, he paused, not for danger, but because the fog made it hard to tell whether he was about to step on a root or into a fox's leftover breakfast. Visibility was low, which was typical. The sun had once promised to rise promptly, but had since taken to showing up late, hungover, and draped in clouds. Stooping carefully, Oswin began the ritual known as gathering sticks, while attempting not to be bitten by anything. He collected only what could fit under one arm, and passed the mildly damp, but still possibly flammable test. Each twig was examined with the scrutiny of a jeweler, because wasting energy on something that turned out to be too soggy to ignite was a kind of personal betrayal. Back at the hut, the hearth had not magically lit itself in his absence. Uncle Grifflet had wandered off in search of eggs that may or may not have existed, and the cousins had taken to arguing over who got the warm spot next to the goat. That left Oswin to orchestrate the fire with the solemn focus of a monk, if monks worked exclusively with soot and mild resentment. The process was neither fast nor dignified. It involved stacking twigs like anxious game pieces, coaxing a spark from a flintstone that hated being touched, and blowing gently until he resembled a very sad accordion. Eventually, with a pop and a sigh, a thread of smoke appeared, followed by the smallest of flames. The room was filled with an aroma best described as aged moss and ambition. Still, it was fire, and that meant life. Sort of. The heat, such as it was, drifted upward, immediately, ignoring everyone on the floor entirely. The only way to benefit was to sit directly beside it, nose nearly in the flame, and pretend you weren't becoming slowly smoked like a sausage. Oswin did exactly this, while cradling the warm stone from earlier, which had now cooled to a temperature best described as decidedly not helpful. Once fingers had thawed enough to resume bending, it was time for the next task, insulating the hut for the day's chill. This involved what his family generously called the stuffing of gaps, where anything vaguely fluffy or pliable was shoved into holes in the wall. Old cloth, dried moss hay, and a few strips of Cousin Edric's forgotten under tunic were all fair game. The trick wasn't sealing out the cold entirely, an impossible dream, but slowing it down enough that it didn't settle in your bones by mid-afternoon. The hut looked increasingly like a badly curated scarecrow exhibit. Outside, the fog had thickened, wrapping the village in what Oswin's aunt called God's woolen sock. Visibility was reduced to the length of a sigh, and everything was damp. The kind of damp that got into your thoughts, but it was nearly time for market, and that meant preparation. Oswin's job was to gather the trade goods, which in their case meant 3 turnips of uncertain age, a small wheel of cheese that had once rolled into a puddle and never fully recovered, and a wooden spoon carved too aggressively by Uncle Grifflet during an argument about taxes. He wrapped them carefully in cloth, tied them into a bundle, and fastened them to a makeshift sled, crafted from a broken door and a sense of determination. The journey to market was not far, but it was through a lane that turned to swamp whenever the wind sneezed in its direction. Oswin set off slowly, pulling the sled behind him, with the solemn pace of a man escorting a reluctant relative to confession. Each step was a squish, each breath a fog. Along the way, he passed neighbors, some trudging, some muttering, one attempting to teach a chicken how to walk in a straight line. No one questioned these activities. Survival made everyone a little odd. At market, the village square resembled a gathering of tents, carts, and people all pretending they weren't freezing. The stalls were simple planks on barrels, blankets on crates, and in one case, a pig standing very still next to a price sign. Oswin laid out his wares, trying not to look too desperate, which was difficult given the state of his hood. Trade was slow. A traveling pot seller haggled loudly with a shepherd over something involving sheep and promises. A woman offered Oswin a handful of dried apples for the cheese. He accepted immediately, forgetting until too late that the apples had been dried in someone's attic next to a pile of onions. Still, calories were calories. By noon, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing the pale outline of the sun, trying to pretend it hadn't been hiding. Oswin took this as a sign to return home. Trade complete, feet damp, and thoughts even damper. The sled squeaked behind him like a tired mouse. Back at the hut, the fire had been but not watched. A bit of soot had exploded into the ceiling, and the cousins were now covered in decorative ash, which they took as a mark of honor. Oswin set down the apples, tucked the turnips back into the root basket, and sat once again near the hearth, where the warmth was more suggestion than reality. He glanced at Mags, the goat who blinked at him as if to say, "This is survival." And Oswin, not for the first time, wondered if tomorrow might bring something warmer, or at the very least, less damp. But for now, the day was not done. There was still the matter of repairing the fence which had once stood proudly, or at least upright, between Mags the goat and the neighbor's vegetable plot. At some indeterminate point during the morning, probably while Oswin was perfecting the fine art of not freezing in the market square, Mags had taken it upon herself to rearrange the local geography. The fence now leaned inward, like it was whispering secrets to the ground, and Mags chewing a suspicious-looking leaf with the self-satisfaction of a creature who had bested both man and wood, showed no remorse. Uncle Grifflet stood beside the wreckage, arms folded, eyes narrowed in the way only a man who had already yelled about 3 other things today could manage. "It's your goat," he muttered. "And your turnip profits bought her, as I recall." Oswin didn't recall that not precisely. But Mags was indeed his in the same way a thunderstorm belongs to whoever leaves their boots outside. He approached the fence with the resigned air of a man who has accepted his destiny is entangled with splinters. The wood was damp, of course. Everything was damp. The nails were either missing or so rusted they held on out of spite. Oswin knelt, feeling the cold seep through his trousers like a poorly written prophecy. Repairing a fence with limited tools and no nails is a skill few modern handbooks cover. But Oswin had the benefit of a grandmother who once tied 2 wagon wheels together, using only bark and sheer disappointment. Using bits of twine, a few notched branches, and something that might have once been a curtain rod, he began lashing the slats into something vaguely upright. Mags watched him work occasionally, chewing on a corner of his tunic, when she felt unacknowledged. Every so often, she bleated, as if offering creative direction. After some time, measured not in minutes, but in the number of times, Oswin had to stand up, brush off his knees, and sigh theatrically. The fence stood again. Not well, not proudly, but upright enough to suggest at least one human had tried. That was the standard in these parts, not perfection, just evidence of trying. And perhaps a goat on the correct side of the barrier. Mags gave the new construction one half-hearted nudge, and finding it less cooperative than before, settled on glaring at it, while she resumed chewing whatever passed for vegetation in late winter. Oswin returned to the hut with straw in his boots, mud on his sleeves, and the creeping realization that it was time for the next dreaded task of the day, collecting water. Now, if one were lucky, and Oswin was not there, might have been a well with a winch and a bucket that didn't leak. If one were moderately cursed, there was at least a stream nearby. Oswin's village, however, had a seasonal trickle, which was the polite term for a muddy rut in the earth that occasionally remembered how to be wet. The closest usable water came from the communal spring located halfway down a hill that had been designed by nature to collect every unpleasant wind slope-induced puddle and wandering goose within 20 miles. The bucket Oswin carried was not so much a container as a suggestion. Its handle squeaked like a choir of disgruntled mice, and the wood was lined with cracks that had long ago become permanent features. Still, it held enough water to be useful if filled slowly and carried gently and whispered to like a shy horse. The walk to the spring was long cold and largely uphill in both directions, thanks to an uneven path and Oswin's persistent suspicion that reality was mildly rigged against him. Other villagers passed by with similar burdens, buckets sloshing pails, bundles of wet laundry destined for equally wet drying lines. There wasn't much talk. Winter dampens conversation as effectively as it does clothes. At the spring, he waited his turn behind a woman, scrubbing something that had once been a child's tunic and now resembled a shredded flag. The water, cold and slightly green, gurgled from a rock basin where lichen grew with suspicious enthusiasm. Oswin dipped the bucket carefully, trying not to upset the tiny layer of surface calm that disguised the spring's true temperature liquid frostbite. When it was full, or at least 3/4 full, before the inevitable dribbling began, he rose and began the slow trudge back. This time, gravity assisted, which made the carrying trickier, but slightly faster. The path was narrow and slippery. Twice he nearly dropped the bucket. Once he did, and retrieved it with a groan that echoed off the trees. By the time he reached the hut again, his arms felt like overcooked eels. His boots squelched in ways boots were never meant to, and the water was still only barely above the enough to scrub things with threshold. Inside the hut was moderately warmer, thanks to the stuttering fire and the number of bodies huddled near it. Someone had found half a cabbage and was boiling it in a pot that made alarming noises. The smell was nutritional. Oswin set the bucket down near the hearth and accepted a mug of warm broth, mostly water, slightly turnip-flavored, with the texture of second-hand soup. He sipped slowly, watching the steam curl upward, and imagining a world where water came from walls and goats respected fences. But daydreams were luxuries for people with full bellies and dry socks. Next, it was time for scrubbing. Not of one's own self, heaven forbid that much indulgence, but of things mostly cloth-related, occasionally utensil-adjacent, and always deeply unprepared for the medieval definition of cleanliness. After Oswin finished sipping the last of his turnip broth in theory, he set down the mug and took up his next responsibility, laundering the week's linens. Linens, in this case, was a charitable term for a collection of woolen rags, rough-spun tunics, and a single sock, with aspirations of finding its partner someday in the next century. Bathing clothes was considered a more practical investment than bathing people. After all, clothes could be hung beaten and dried without protest, whereas people tended to get shivery and require extra broth. Oswin filled a basin from the freshly collected bucket, half spilling most of it on the floor, which the cousins immediately declared an indoor pond and added a dash of ash soap. The soap had been made by his aunt during a period of excessive optimism last summer, and retained the scent of ambition mixed with burnt dandelion. He stirred the water until it turned a color best described as historically accurate gray, then plunged the garments in one by one. Each piece required vigorous rubbing, a fair amount of muttering, and at least 2 turns of being slapped against a flat rock kept beside the hearth for precisely that purpose. The rock had a name, though no one remembered it, and was slightly concave from decades of textile-related indignities. The water quickly became opaque, the garments only marginally improved, and Oswin's knuckles, raw from both effort and the occasional angry thread. The hut filled with the steamy, slightly sour aroma of wet wool and ash. Mags sneezed in protest and retreated to a corner where she proceeded to chew her cud loudly while glaring at a cousin. The youngest cousin, inspired by nothing in particular, decided to attempt sliding across the wet floor on his stomach. He succeeded in creating a trail of sludge from hearth to door, and earned a soft rebuke from Aunt Edritha, who was half asleep and only semi-aware of what anyone was doing. Oswin, elbows deep in laundry water that had begun to chill, despite the fire's heroic efforts, tried not to think about the laundry drying process. That would be later, after the clothes had hung in the smoke and steam long enough to acquire the scent of cured jerky rather than bog ghost. For now, the focus was on squeezing wringing, and occasionally wondering whether a certain stain was biological, agricultural, or existential. Once the worst of the scrubbing was done, and the water resembled something that might be used to summon spirits, Oswin carried the basin outside to empty it. It sloshed heavily, like a sack of tired thoughts. He dumped it behind the hut in the designated laundry puddle, a spot so permanently soggy it had started growing moss in the shape of old socks. Returning inside, he found the fire sputtering slightly under a wet log someone had optimistically tossed in. The hut was now foggier than the forest, and significantly warmer in a way that encouraged drowsiness but discouraged productivity. Still, the laundry had to be hung. Thin ropes had been strung crisscross above the hearth beams, creating a kind of indoor spider web for steaming tunics and sagging underpants. Oswin climbed onto the stool, wobbly as always, with one leg shorter than its cousins, and began the delicate act of balancing wet cloth over the lines without getting soot smudges in unfortunate places. Each garment made the air heavier, the scent smokier, and the atmosphere slightly more theatrical. The clothes dripped softly onto the hearthstones, forming little puddles that hissed as they met the warmer spots. Once everything was up, Oswin stepped down and surveyed his handiwork. It looked less like laundry and more like someone had tried to hang their regrets to dry. But they would be dry by morning, or at least less wet. That was enough. Aunt Edritha, now more awake than before, and holding a spoon with the authority of someone who had seen too many undercooked roots in her life, beckoned Oswin toward the wooden tub in the corner. It was bath night. Not for him. Not yet. His turn was several rotations away, but for Cousin Elric, who had managed to avoid the task for nearly a fortnight by hiding inside hay carts and feigning dramatic coughing spells. But Aunt Edritha had grown wise to his ways, and now wielded her spoon like a scepter of hygiene. Oswin fetched more water, lukewarm now, but still slightly cleaner than the boy, and poured it into the tub along with another sliver of soap. Elric sulked his way into the bath with the enthusiasm of a cat about to be dunked. The process involved much splashing, occasional howling, and one brief moment where the tub nearly tipped from Elric's flailing. Oswin kept his distance, adding water as needed, and offering half-hearted encouragement in the form of, "You're cleaner than you were, and that bit behind your ear still looks like moss." After much drama and a final rinse with a mug of water poured from height for maximum effect, Elric emerged damp, shivering, and slightly less gray. He was wrapped in the cleanest cloth available, a curtain with ambitions of being a towel, and shoved toward the fire to dry off alongside the socks. Oswin emptied the tub with practiced effort, avoiding the worst of the splashback, and set it aside for the next unlucky participant, who, judging by the way Cousin Wymond was suddenly pretending to sleep with his eyes open, would be drafted sooner than expected, with laundry. Dripping soup, steaming, and bath water, steaming slightly less than it should. Oswin finally sat down again on the stool. His legs ached in the dull, throbbing way that signaled a full day's labor had been achieved without fanfare or reward. Outside, the light was fading into the slushy gray of pre-evening. Shadows lengthened. The goat made her bedtime complaint, and the fire brave little heap that it was needed. More fuel. It always did. Fire, like goats and siblings, was never quite satisfied. It crackled politely when tended, sulked when ignored, and occasionally spat a spark onto the floor, just to remind everyone it could still be dangerous if it wanted to. Oswin leaned forward on the three-legged stool, now slightly more trustworthy, after a strategic stone had been wedged under the offending short leg, and reached for the firewood basket. The basket, to use the term generously, was a lopsided arrangement of splinters and hope barely holding together beneath the weight of damp branches and split logs that had spent just enough time indoors to believe they were dry without actually being so. He selected a handful of the less suspicious ones, tapping each on the stone hearth in case it harbored any unexpected residents like beetles or mild curses. The wood hissed as he placed it onto the glowing coals, curling with smoke and steam, before settling into the rhythm of burning slowly and begrudgingly. Oswin adjusted the log pile with a stick that once may have been part of a broom or a weapon no one remembered anymore, and watched as the flames reluctantly grew, casting their jittery light across the low-beamed ceiling and up onto the freshly hung laundry like stage lights, highlighting the tragic performance of damp socks. The room smelled of wood smoke, wet wool, and cabbage, which was to say, like every evening since November. A cousin coughed gently in the corner, the universal village signal for "I'm not sick, but someone should pay attention to me," while Mags, the goat, rustled against the wall in her corner stall, occasionally tapping the boards in that soft, unsettling way that made it sound like she was rehearsing an escape. Aunt Edritha stirred the soup with a long-handled ladle that also served as a pointing device, disciplinary tool, and occasional door prop. The cabbage and barley mix had reached the consistency of warm porridge and the color of indecision, with occasional flecks of carrot bravely surfacing like survivors of a long voyage. Oswin could hear the wind rising outside, pushing at the walls with the determination of someone who really wanted to be let in for tea. The wind was a regular visitor, especially this time of year, and had a habit of finding new cracks to explore, whistling gently through gaps in the wattle and daub like a gossip who didn't knock first. To counteract this, the family had long employed the venerable technique known as the draft blockade, which involved stuffing rags, old cloaks, unused boots, and in one memorable case, a deceased ferret pelt into any space where air moved too freely. Tonight, Oswin took it upon himself to reinforce the blockade, grabbing a handful of worn cloth from the hearth basket and wedging it along the door frame where the wind's persistent fingers had begun to prod at the straw mat floor. The cloth was cold and slightly greasy, as most things were by midwinter, but it held fast once jammed into place with a ladle handle. Aunt Edritha nodded approvingly, without looking up from her soup. The fire warmed the front of Oswin's shins, while the rest of him remained at a temperature best described as outdoor storage, and the soup now gurgled with the reassuring sound of something almost ready. Evening meals in the hut were less a matter of ritual and more a coordinated act of hunger management. There was one wooden table, so low it resembled an overgrown shelf, and 3 stools, one of which had to be shared or knelt beside. The rest of the family used knees floor cushions or stood near the hearth bowls in hand, staring at the pot as if willing it to produce meat. There would be no meat, of course. Not tonight. Perhaps not for weeks. The occasional scrap of lard, a shred of preserved something from the root cellar, or a lone sliver of bacon from Aunt Edritha's emergency stash might appear on holidays or during thunder. But tonight was cabbage and barley, heavy on the barley. When the soup was deemed sufficiently thick to resist escape, Aunt Edritha began ladling it into bowls. Each portion was equal in theory, but varied depending on the ladle's mood and the direction she was leaning. Oswin received his with a polite nod, accepting the chipped wooden bowl with both hands and retreating to his favorite sitting spot near the door, where the draught was strongest, but the view of the hearth unobstructed. He blew gently on the surface, watching it steam, then took a cautious sip. The soup was hot dense, and tasted almost exactly like it had the night before, and the one before that, with only subtle differences in texture to suggest someone had forgotten to stir it at a critical moment. He ate slowly, savoring the warmth more than the flavor, grateful for the solid presence of something inside his stomach. Around him, the rest of the family murmured their approval in the form of grunts, nods, and the occasional spoon tapping against the rim of a bowl. Conversation was sparse, not out of lack of interest, but because talking while eating meant losing heat. The silence was companionable, filled with the sounds of chewing, crackling logs, the drip of drying laundry, and Mags occasionally snorting in her sleep. Once the bowls were scraped mostly clean, and the last heel of rye bread had been passed around and bitten suspiciously to confirm it was still edible. The family settled into their usual post-supper arrangement. Cousins wrestled quietly for position. Near the fire, Aunt Edritha began knitting a sock that appeared doomed from the start, and Uncle Grifflet muttered something about taxes while poking the coals with the same stick Oswin had used earlier. Oswin himself leaned back against the doorframe bowl in lap eyes, drifting toward the flickering shadows that danced across the ceiling beams. The draught had softened now, either out of boredom or because the blockade was holding. The warmth from the fire was slowly winning its battle against the dampness in his sleeves. His eyelids drooped. He thought briefly of the chores still undone wood, to split traps, to check the roof, to inspect. But they felt far away, like worries for someone older, taller, or possibly fictional. The fire popped again. Mags shifted and sighed deeply, like a goat who had read the evening's agenda and found it lacking. And then, in the quiet that followed, just as Oswin felt himself slipping into the heavy stillness of sleep, there came a knock, not a loud one, not sharp, but deliberate. A knock at the door low and almost embarrassed, as if the knocker regretted it halfway through and hoped no one would answer. Oswin blinked. For a moment, he thought it might have been Mags thumping her hooves again, protesting the temperature or the lack of dessert. But Mags was still snoring softly, curled like a loaf of bread, gone slightly goat-shaped, and the sound had come not from her corner, but from the threshold itself. Another knock followed, slightly firmer this time, like a second attempt to be brave without causing a scene. The room stirred. Aunt Edritha looked up from her half-finished sock. Uncle Grifflet froze mid-grumble, the fire poker hovering in the air like a weapon with a day job. Even the cousins paused in their squabble over the warmest blanket, their faces turning toward the door with a mixture of hope, fear, and the resigned curiosity only found in people who knew that nothing good ever knocked during cabbage season. Oswin set his bowl down on the stone floor and stood, joints clicking like poorly oiled hinges. He reached for the latch, more out of habit than enthusiasm, and pulled the door open with the sort of caution one normally reserved for suspicious parcels or sleeping badgers. Outside stood a figure wrapped in so many layers of cloth. It was difficult to determine if they were man, woman, or particularly motivated laundry. A scarf was wound around their head with surgical precision, and their boots, sturdy, mud-caked things, looked like they had walked from somewhere much colder and less forgiving than here. The figure held a sack over one shoulder, damp and bulging, and the smell of its contents had already begun a quiet campaign to infiltrate the hut. It was not a violent odor, just persistent, like onions that had secrets, or fish that had decided to stay past their welcome. "Evening," the figure said, voice muffled by both scarf and exhaustion. "I'm looking for shelter. Just the night. Got coin?" At the mention of coin, Uncle Grifflet perked up in a way that suggested several internal calculations had just taken place. Aunt Edritha narrowed her eyes, her sock forgotten. Oswin hesitated. The rules of hospitality were clear even in a village this small. You didn't turn away a traveler in the cold, especially not one with frost in their eyebrows and a sack that might have once contained something edible. He stepped aside. "Come in, then. Mind the goat." The visitor entered with the stiff-legged gait of someone who had walked too far on roads not meant for shoes. The firelight revealed more details: a narrow face, tired eyes, and fingers that trembled not from fear, but from the chill that still clung to them like a second skin. The sack was set down near the door with a thump that caused Mags to snort and shift. "Name's Teb," the stranger said, unwinding the scarf and revealing a face that might have been younger than it looked, but had clearly seen enough winters to distrust them all. Teb, of nowhere in particular. "That's our favorite kind," Grifflet replied, motioning toward the fire. "No baggage. At least, not the kind that talks." Teb gave a half-smile and crouched near the hearth, stretching hands out toward the dancing flames. The sack, left politely by the door, began to emit stronger opinions about its presence, and Oswin found himself edging away from it instinctively. Aunt Adritha, never one to be shy about unpleasant truths, poked the sack with the toe of her boot. "That's not meat, is it?" "No," Teb replied. "Roots. Maybe a fish. Might have been fresher this morning." "Still counts," said Grifflet, apparently satisfied. A bowl of soup was fetched, bread, scraped for edible bits, and Teb accepted both with the solemn gratitude of someone who had dined more recently on bark than broth. The hut resumed its previous rhythm, albeit slightly altered by the presence of a stranger who coughed softly and smelled like damp moss and optimism gone wrong. Oswin sat again, not quite at ease, but not alarmed either. Teb didn't talk much, but when he did, it was with the air of someone used to listening more than speaking. He answered questions without volunteering, mentioned towns no one had heard of, and offered no stories unless directly asked. The sack now relocated near the hearth in hopes the smell might burn off steamed faintly. "Traveled far?" Oswin asked after a long pause in which only the fire had spoken. "Far enough," Teb replied. "North Road's a mess. Ice on the trees. Saw a dead ox in a ditch wearing a crown of icicles." "Symbolic," Grifflet muttered. "Or dramatic." "Could have been both," Teb said, tearing a piece of bread with the precision of someone who had once made a loaf last 4 days. "Winds shifting. Storm coming." This earned a general murmur of agreement. Everyone had felt it the way the cold seemed to be sharpening rather than fading, the way the clouds had hung low all day, like curtains refusing to rise. "You alone?" Aunt Adritha asked, not unkindly. Teb nodded, but his eyes flicked toward the sack as he did so. Oswin noticed, but said nothing. Instead, he stood and added more wood to the fire, watching the flames rise with reluctant enthusiasm. The laundry still hung above, now mostly dry, but fully smoky, and the cousins had begun to drift off, each one curled like a cat, near warmth, bundled under layers of fabric, stitched by memory and obligation. Mags dozed her ears, twitching at dreams of misplaced fences. The night deepened. The wind hissed against the walls, and somewhere beyond the village, the storm that Teb had spoken of began to gather its thoughts. But inside the hut, all was still. For now. Oswin watched the sack again. It had settled into silence, but a single dark patch had begun to spread beneath it on the floor. A patch that glistened faintly in the firelight, slow and syrupy, like sap with ambition. Oswin stared at it, longer than he meant to, his eyes narrowing as the faint smell of fish turned more complex, adding notes of damp wood, something slightly metallic, and the unmistakable trace of old garlic. He looked at Teb, who was now half reclined near the hearth, one hand loosely curled around the empty soup bowl, the other resting just beside his boot, as if he'd meant to stretch, but fallen asleep before completing the motion. His breathing was steady, but his fingers twitched every so often, and Oswin wasn't entirely convinced it was from dreams. Aunt Edritha had nodded off her knitting, abandoned in her lap, the half-finished sock now drooping toward the floor, like a defeated flag. Uncle Grifflet had retreated to his corner, with a sigh muttering something about old knees and worse weather, and the cousins were asleep in an untidy row beside the hearthstones, limbs tangled and faces slack with the deep, dreamless rest of children who'd run themselves ragged hours ago. Only Mags remained alert, eyes half-lidded, but pointed firmly in the direction of the sack. Her nose twitched once, then again, and she emitted a faint, goatish grumble that Oswin recognized as the sound she made when something displeased her, usually cabbages, occasionally spiders, and once, memorably, a painting of a bishop. Oswin stood slowly, his joints stiff from the cold floor and the kind of tension that settled behind your eyes when your instincts didn't trust the evidence in front of them. He moved toward the sack with care, avoiding the creaky floorboards and slipping once on a smear of soup near the fire. He crouched beside it and gave the cloth a gentle nudge with the tip of a stick someone had left leaning against the wall. The sack didn't react at first. Then it shifted. Not much, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Oswin froze, his breath catching in his throat. A soft squelch followed, and the dark patch on the floor widened by a thumb's width. He tapped the sack again this time, a little harder. Another squelch, this one accompanied by a faint, wet hiss that might have been steam, or something else entirely. He considered waking Aunt Edritha, but she had the expression of someone who would only rise in the event of fire, or a tax collector. Grifflet snored from his corner, a sound that could mask a dozen murders, and had, according to family lore, once caused a passing traveler to think the hut was under siege. Oswin leaned in closer, regretting it immediately, but unable to stop. He reached out with one hand, fingers hovering just above the damp, bulging cloth, and gave it the lightest press. Something inside the sack shifted again this time, with weight. Not a slosh, not a roll. Something deliberate. Something with form. He pulled his hand back, fast, heart thumping, like a knock at the wrong door. Behind him, the fire crackled. Teb stirred, murmured something unintelligible, and shifted in his sleep, turning slightly, so his face was now more visible in the flickering light. His eyes stayed closed, but his expression had changed no longer, slack with rest, but tight around the edges, like a man listening from within a dream. Oswin turned back to the sack. He wasn't brave enough to untie it. Not yet. But he didn't want to leave it either. Instead, he grabbed an old iron pot lid from beside the fire, the one used to trap smoke when the stew went wrong, and placed it gently atop the sack. It wasn't much, but it was heavy, and he told himself it would be enough to keep anything inside from getting too curious. Then, because sleep was a luxury only fools pursued during weird nights with mysterious guests, he sat beside the door, back against the frame, and watched both the sack and Teb through the thin mist of smoke now curling lazily from the hearth. Outside, the wind picked up. It made the rafters creak and the shutters rattle in their frames. Somewhere far off, a tree groaned in protest. A cold draft slipped under the door, curling around Oswin's ankles like a bored cat, and he pulled his cloak tighter, resisting the urge to throw another log on the fire for fear of waking the entire room. Hours passed, or minutes, that felt like them. Oswin blinked slowly, fighting sleep with the sort of determination normally reserved for balancing soup bowls on uneven stools. The sack remained still. Teb didn't move again, though once Oswin could have sworn he saw a finger twitch, not like someone dreaming, but like someone counting. Just as he was beginning to consider the possibility that he'd imagined the whole thing, that the leak, the shift, the squelch were all tricks of a tired mind. He heard a sound, not a loud sound, just a quiet, deliberate snap, like a twig cracking under careful weight. He looked down. The pot lid had moved. Not much, just a tilt, but enough to show it hadn't stayed where he left it. His breath caught. He turned toward Teb, who still appeared to be asleep, though his chest rose and fell now with a strange rhythm, as if timed to something other than breath. Oswin stood again slower, this time, knees groaning, heart hammering against his ribs with all the subtlety of a blacksmith's apprentice. He crossed the room in 2 cautious steps and reached out toward the lid. As his fingers brushed it, the sack shifted once more, and from within it came a faint, unmistakable sound, a sigh. Not human, not quite, but not either. It was the sound of something that had once been alive, or wanted to be, or still wasn't sure. Oswin's hand recoiled. He took a step back, then another, until his heel struck the firewood basket, and he nearly fell. Teb's eyes opened, wide, bright, and not entirely surprised. "I told you," he said, softly, voice low and hoarse, like wind through dead leaves, just for the night. The sack moved again, with the kind of squirming motion no sack ought to manage. It wasn't violent, nothing so direct, but it pulsed gently, rhythmically, like a slow inhale through something wet and unwilling. The sigh came again, lower this time, followed by a shudder that traveled through the floorboards, as if the air itself was choosing not to behave. Oswin, still frozen, halfway between standing and running, realized his feet were colder than usual. Not the usual midnight chill, but a sharpness like standing on river stones that hadn't seen sunlight in years. The draft had changed. It had shape now. Not a wind exactly, but a presence moving low along the floor and curling softly around corners, as though searching for gaps in the world. Teb sat up fully now, eyes wide and unblinking arms resting on his knees, as if he'd been expecting this moment with the same inevitability as soup boiling over, or goats eating things they shouldn't. Didn't want to open it. He murmured his voice, no louder than a page turning. "That's the trick, you know. You carry it long enough, it gets heavy, but not from what's inside, from what's waiting." Oswin opened his mouth to ask something what exactly he wasn't sure, but before he could form a sound, the lid on the sack tipped fully to one side and fell with a soft clang to the floor. It didn't bounce. It just landed and stayed there, as if the air had thickened into something solid enough to catch it. The sack shifted again, unfolding at the top, without help, the cloth drawing back, like a curtain pulled by invisible hands. A smell rose up, not rotting, not fresh, but old, in a way that made the back of Oswin's tongue itch, like dust that had waited centuries to be disturbed. Aunt Edritha stirred in her chair, muttering something about thimbles and carrots, but did not wake. The fire crackled once, then settled into a lower, quieter burn, as if deciding not to get involved. Teb stood slowly, every motion deliberate, as though reminding his limbs which way was forward. I was meant to leave it in the mountains, he said, not to Oswin specifically, but perhaps to the sack or to the silence now pressing in around them. But the roads were bad, and the mountains, well, they didn't want it. Oswin took a hesitant step closer against the judgment of every muscle in his body. The inside of the sack was no longer visible, not in the usual way. It wasn't dark, not exactly. More like it had depth where none should be. As if looking inside a well dug not into the earth, but into memory or time or whatever existed between breath and dream. The sigh came again longer this time, and with it a rustling sound like dry leaves brushing against silk. Oswin didn't want to look, but he did, just for a second. And what he saw was not a shape, not fully. It was suggestion, possibility, something with too many edges, or not enough unfolding in a space that seemed to refuse corners. He blinked, and it was gone, or hidden, or pretending. "You brought this here?" Oswin said, finally, voice hoarse and dry. "You brought that." Teb nodded slowly. "Didn't mean to stay, just needed warmth. Rest. I thought it might sleep too. But it doesn't. Not really. It remembers what Oswin whispered." Teb looked at him, now really looked, eyes like candle wicks burning low. Before he said, before everything had names, when things were still quiet, "It wants to go back." The sack made another sound, this one almost like laughter, but soft and distant, as if recalling a joke no one living would find funny. Something inside shifted, not toward them, but upward, testing the air. Mags bleated. Suddenly the short, sharp cry that echoed too loud in the small space, and Oswin turned just in time to see her bolt toward the rear wall, hooves scrabbling on straw. The cousins stirred, murmuring in sleep. Aunt Edritha muttered something about keeping the fire going. Uncle Grifflet gave a sudden snore and rolled onto his side. None of them woke. The thing in the sack pulsed once more, and the air near it seemed to fold in slightly, like fabric creased by a thumb. Teb took a slow step forward, raising one hand, not threateningly, more like a gesture of apology. "I can take it," he said. If I move before dawn, I can lose the worst of it in the marshlands. The fog there confuses it, makes it slow. Why bring it here? Oswin asked again, louder this time, though he still didn't dare raise his voice. Why not bury it? Burn it? Drop it down a pit and walk away. Teb gave a tired smile, more skin than joy. Because it follows, he said. It remembers, and forgetting it only makes it louder. Oswin didn't understand. Not fully. But something inside him, something new and practical, recognized the truth of what Teb was saying. Some burdens didn't vanish when dropped. They lingered, soaking into the ground, seeping through cracks, finding their way back, like water through stone. What does it want? Oswin asked, though he already suspected. Teb looked down at the sack, and the sack pulsed once, gently, as if answering for itself. To be carried, he said, by someone else. Oswin felt the chill again curling around his ankles, rising up his legs like a question he didn't want to answer. The wind outside howled once, sharp and high, and the fire dimmed to a soft, flickering glow. The sack sat still, now quiet, but Oswin could feel it, not watching, not waiting, but offering. And somewhere deep inside, a part of him leaned forward, curious cold, and closer to the sack than he remembered moving. Just half a pace, maybe less. His boots still sat in the same muddy puddle left by the evening's water bucket, but his toes itched, like they'd crept forward on their own, lured by the strange, rhythmic pulse, now completely inaudible, but somehow felt behind the eyes. Teb hadn't moved again, but he watched Oswin with the expression of someone who's seen this before and knows how it ends. Not with screaming or chasing or fire, but with silence. With someone taking the handle of a burden they never meant to carry. You don't have to touch it, Teb said, voice soft like a lullaby meant for a dying man. You just have to wonder. That's how it begins. Oswin blinked, hard, turned his head to look anywhere else at the sleeping cousins curled together like puppies beside the hearth at Aunt Edritha's. Still fingers resting on her half-knit sock at Mag's, the goat now pressed so hard into the far corner her shape was almost lost in the shadows. But the sack called him back, not loudly, but insistently, like a tap on the shoulder, from someone too polite to interrupt, but too patient to leave. He backed up a step, the air growing colder, as he did the way it sometimes felt when you turned your back to a window in winter and the wind outside noticed. You said, It remembers, he said to Teb, whose eyes flicked briefly to the sack and then back again, as if confirming it hadn't moved, or perhaps that it had. Does it forget anything? Teb's expression was unreadable for a long moment. Then, slowly, he shook his head. It doesn't need to forget, he said. It waits. Every time someone sets it down, it waits for the next hearth, the next fire, the next curious pair of hands. Sometimes it's weeks, sometimes years, but it always finds warmth. Oswin stared again at the cloth still slack, still folded, but now with the weight of a dozen conversations hanging in the folds. The dark patch on the floor had dried or sunk in or been forgotten by the wood, but its shape remained faint and circular, like something imprinted by time rather than liquid. He didn't want to ask the next question. It was already in his mouth before he realized. How long did you carry it? Teb didn't smile, didn't flinch, just answered. Long enough that I don't remember where I picked it up. Might have been in the south woods or near the sea. Maybe someone left it for me in the chapel ruins. Doesn't matter. I took it because someone else set it down. And that's all it ever needs. The sack rustled faintly, and Oswin saw a corner of the cloth rise a little like a hand reaching for a better grip. It didn't seem threatening. It seemed patient. Beside him, the fire popped. Embers leapt briefly into the air, and the shadows flared up the walls, exaggerating the shapes of the hanging laundry, the hunched shoulders of the sleepers, the narrow line of Teb's back. But what is it? Oswin whispered, not wanting an answer, but needing one anyway. What's inside Teb hesitated. I don't think it matters anymore. What's inside changes, becomes. It's a weight, not a thing. A memory made solid. The more you try to define it, the more it fits that shape. Could be guilt, could be fear, could be that dream you keep waking from the one with the door you never open. It doesn't care. It only wants to be carried. And it gets lighter the longer you hold it until you forget you're holding it at all. Oswin shook his head. I'd know. Would you? Teb asked, and there was some mockery in his voice. Just exhaustion. Just truth. The sack pulsed again. Or maybe it was just the light shifting. But Oswin felt it, in his knees, in the tightness behind his eyes, in the way his hands suddenly itched, like they needed to grab something just to be still. He turned away, not trusting himself to look any longer. I need to sleep, he said. We'll talk in the morning. Teb said nothing. The sack said nothing. But Oswin felt both of them watching as he returned to his place by the hearth, lay down on the same straw-filled mat he used every night, and pulled the same scratchy blanket over his shoulders. The warmth came slow, reluctant. The fire was low. The cousins snored. Mags rustled. And the wind outside picked up again louder, now rattling the shutters and whispering along the roof line like a forgotten prayer. Oswin closed his eyes, but sleep did not come. Not quickly, not cleanly. When he did finally drift off, it was into dreams shaped like narrow paths and heavy satchels, like voices calling names he didn't recognize, and objects just out of reach. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a weight pressed gently on his chest, not enough to choke, just enough to remind him it was there, waiting. And in the darkest part of night, just before dawn, Oswin shifted slightly in his sleep, and his hand moved, and his fingers curled toward something unseen, something coarse, and just barely warm. Not like the comfort of wool warmed by fire, or the soft breath of a sleeping goat. No, this warmth felt borrowed, faint and distant, like the last glow of a stone left near embers hours ago. Oswin's fingers closed around it instinctively, and in that slow, half-dreaming moment where thought and sensation blur, he imagined it was his blanket, a fold of the mat, or perhaps his own cloak bunched beneath him. But the texture was wrong, too smooth in parts, too rough in others. Threads that tugged slightly when pulled, as if the object didn't want to be taken, or didn't believe it belonged to him yet. In the stillness of the hut, nothing stirred. Even the wind had decided to rest, curling itself into the chimney and muttering soft complaints down into the ashes. The fire was a faint glow now, hardly more than memory, and smoke. One of the cousins coughed lightly in their sleep. A bowl tipped slowly onto its side near the wall, and came to rest against a stack of firewood, silent again. Oswin didn't open his eyes. Some part of him, the older part, the part that paid attention to birds in strange weather and goats acting nervous, understood that opening his eyes might change everything. So he lay still, fingers curled around the thing that wasn't his blanket, heart thudding slow and heavy in the dark. The object or presence beneath his hand gave the slightest tremble. Not a movement, a recognition, as if it had been waiting for this moment, not actively, not eagerly, but with the calm patience of a stone at the bottom of a well. And now it had been touched. Oswin's breath caught in his throat. His fingers twitched just once, and the thing beneath them responded not by pulling away, but by settling, as if it had found the right hand, the proper grip, and needn't struggle anymore. He felt it in his chest, before he felt it in his mind. A subtle pull, not physical, not sharp, but insistent. A gravity of sorts, pulling not his body, but his thoughts. A soft hush in his ears, like water moving over gravel far away. He opened his eyes. The room was almost entirely dark, now, lit only by the faint shimmer of dying embers and the pale wash of moonlight slipping through a gap in the wallboards. Shapes blurred together. Sleeping forms, the lumpy outline of mags, the familiar sag of the drying line. But near the door, where he knew the sack had rested, something had changed. It was gone. Not visibly, so its shape was still there, folded, slouched, leaning as it had been. But it no longer felt apart from him. It felt near, close, in his grip. He looked down slowly and saw his own hand resting atop cloth that shimmered faintly in the low light, not from brightness, but from memory, as if it held the shine of every eye that had ever looked away too slowly. He let go. The cloth stayed pressed to his palm for half a second longer than gravity should have allowed, and then released him with the faintest sigh barely audible, like parchment shifting in a quiet room. Teb was awake. He was sitting again, knees drawn up, arms wrapped loosely around them. His eyes were not wide nor fearful, just present, as if he'd never truly slept. "It knows you now," he said, voice a whisper, not out of caution, but respect. "You touched it. That's all it ever asks." Oswin didn't respond. Not immediately. He sat up slowly, the mat creaking beneath him, the blanket falling in a soft heap. No one else stirred. Even Mags, normally the first to detect any disturbance greater than a whisper, remained, curled her flanks, rising and falling in steady rhythm. The room had become its own world, hushed and separate from time. "It wasn't beside me when I lay down," Oswin said finally. "It was near the door." Teb nodded. "It moves. Not far. Just close enough. It never wants to be noticed doing it." Oswin rubbed his palms together, half expecting to find soot or dew or the trace of something unnameable. But they were clean, dry, empty. "Why didn't you stop me?" "Because you can't," Teb replied. "No one ever does. You can resist it all day, argue with it, ignore it, burn it, bury it, throw it in the sea. But the moment you wonder what it is, you're already carrying it. I just didn't know if it would choose you." "Choose me for what?" "To be next," Teb said. "To take it. to carry it until you find someone else. Oswin swallowed. His mouth was dry, his tongue like wool. So now I'm cursed. Teb tilted his head slightly. Not cursed. Not exactly. You'll still eat sleep work. You'll be yourself. Just a bit heavier. Just a bit less alone. That's not comforting, Oswin muttered. It's not meant to be, but it's the truth. The sack sat still now, unremarkable, just a bundle of cloth folded in a way that invited neither curiosity nor dismissal. It was part of the room, as if it had always been. Oswin stood slowly. No one else woke. No one else even turned. Teb rose as well. For a long moment, the two stood facing one another in the flickering half-light, two silhouettes in a room that remembered too much. I can't keep it here, Oswin said. Not with them. Teb nodded. Then don't. Take it with you. Walk until it's someone else's burden. Just don't forget you're holding it. That's the real danger. Oswin looked down at the sack again. It didn't pulse now. It didn't sigh. It just waited. And somewhere deep inside, something began to stir. Something not quite memory, not quite fear, but something shaped like responsibility. Something willing. And that something, whatever it was, grew no louder, but somehow more real, the moment Oswin reached down and lifted the sack. It weighed less than it looked, no strain in the shoulders, no pull in the arms, but it settled into his grip with the quiet insistence of a responsibility, accepted even if the terms were never discussed aloud. The cloth was cool to the touch, not cold exactly, but indifferent to the fire's warmth, and the way it shifted slightly in his grasp told Oswin more than he wanted to know. It was awake, not in a conscious way, not watching, not thinking, but present, like a book written in a language you don't speak, but can feel beneath your fingertips. Teb didn't speak again. He just stepped back, giving Oswin the space between them, like a parting of tall grass in a forgotten path. Oswin slung the sack carefully over one shoulder, the way he might have carried firewood or dried herbs from the hill, except this was no herb and no burden he could trade. He looked around once, taking in the quiet shapes of the hut, his aunt's knitting still resting in her lap, Grifflet's feet, poking out from beneath the old quilt, the younger cousins bundled together like spilled laundry, all dreaming dreams that didn't include sacks or sighs or choices made before dawn. The fire had burned itself into a dull glow, casting just enough light to make everything look older. even Mags, who lifted her head and regarded Oswin with the quiet intelligence only goats and certain old trees seem to possess, said nothing. Her eyes followed him, but she did not stir. Teb moved toward the door and unlatched it without a creak. The outside air slipped in like a thief, brushing past Oswin's cheeks and carrying with it the scent of frost mud and distant things best left unnamed. He stepped outside. The night hadn't ended yet, but it was softening. The stars were dim behind thin clouds, the moon a pale smear of silver smeared across the sky like a forgotten breath. The wind had dropped again, replaced by the slow hush of waiting earth and branches leaning into one another for warmth. Oswin took one step forward, then another. The snow, such as it was, had turned to a thin crust crunching beneath his boots, but not so loud as to wake the world. Behind him, the door closed with a soft thump. He didn't turn. Teb was gone by then, whether back into the hut or back into whatever paths he'd wandered in from, Oswin didn't know. The path away from the hut wasn't marked. It never was. He simply walked, following the curve of habit and memory through the low brush, past the grove where the crows nested too early, past the stream that tried each year to forget it had frozen the last. The sack rode easily, swinging a little, settling in like a traveler who knew the route but never the destination. As he walked, he thought about the stories he'd heard growing up, about cursed objects, wandering peddlers, wolves that spoke in riddles. He thought of warnings whispered over candle stubs, and the old songs sung to keep spirits away from the door. But none of those had sounded like this. None of them had included this quiet weight that hummed just at the edge of thought. He realized slowly that the sack didn't feel like danger. Not exactly. It felt like inevitability, like harvest, or winter, or the first gray hair in someone too young to carry regrets. He paused at a bend in the trail where the trees arched above their limbs, thin and bare sketching shapes against the moonlight that might have been letters if one stared too long. He set the sack down for a moment, resting it against a stump that had once been a tree worth remembering. The ground was damp here, but not muddy, and the stillness wrapped around him like an old coat. He crouched beside the sack and reached out, not to open it, but just to touch it again. This time, it didn't move. It simply existed, and in doing so, reminded him again of its nature, not cruel, not kind, just present. Something old, something that had been carried before, and would be again. A noise behind him, just a bird, perhaps, or a twig giving up its strength, caused him to look back. Nothing there, Nothing close, anyway. But he felt eyes. Not eyes made of flesh and bone, but the kind that come with being noticed by something larger than yourself. A presence that didn't look with judgment, only with understanding. The sack didn't sigh this time. It didn't need to. Oswin stood again, brushing cold from his hands. He looked down at the path ahead, winding into the dark, between the trees, still half-shadowed, still uncertain. He would walk it. For now. He didn't know how far, or how long. Only that each step felt quieter than the last, as if the burden, now truly his, had found its rhythm. He slung the sack back over his shoulder and walked on. The path narrowed, the trees leaned closer, and the sound of the world held its breath once more. And in that breathless hush, the forest began to take notice. Not with rustling leaves or sudden flurries, but with stillness so complete that even the usual creaks and nighttime murmurs seemed embarrassed to speak. Oswin felt the shift, not in his ears, but in his bones, a subtle stiffening, as though his own spine had grown cautious. The sack on his shoulder didn't grow heavier, but it seemed more awake now, more settled into its new place, like a cat that had claimed its lap and would not be moved for anything short of fire. He didn't speak aloud. There was no one to answer. But thoughts churned regardless, looping through his mind with the slow persistence of cold water circling a drain. He wondered how many others had walked this same trail, sack slung over shoulder, heart full of questions that would never be asked aloud. How many feet had packed down this soil before his? How many names had been forgotten on this path, because the sack didn't care about names, only about being carried? He adjusted the strap more from nerves than need, and pressed on following the narrowing trail as it ducked beneath low-hanging branches and squeezed between trees that leaned in close, whispering in the secret language of bark and wind. At one point, he paused to drink from a slow-moving stream, the water cold enough to sting his teeth and clear the cobwebs from the corners of his mind. He washed his face, too more out of habit than hope, but the chill helped a little, bringing him back from the sleepy pull that always seemed to linger when the sack got too quiet. He didn't rest. Not properly. He knew better. There was a danger in stillness now, not of beasts or bandits, but of thought. Too much silence, and a man might start to listen too closely to the whispers that weren't his, the memories that didn't belong, the dreams that didn't wait for sleep. The sky had lightened slightly, a pre-dawn gray creeping in from the edges, just enough to give the trees long shadows again. And it was there, in that half-light, that he saw the figure, standing just off the path, not quite hidden, not quite revealed. A person, tall and thin, wrapped in a long coat that looked more like shadow than cloth. They weren't moving, just watching their head tilted slightly to one side in the universal gesture of curious strangers. Oswin slowed. He didn't call out somehow, knowing that if the figure wanted to be greeted, they would have spoken first. Instead, he kept his pace, even his posture careful, and as he passed the place where the figure stood, he allowed an glance sideways. The eyes that met his were dark, not evil, not cruel, but deep in a way that made him think of wells, too old to draw water. "You've taken it," the figure said, voice low, and flat and oddly polite, like someone announcing the arrival of tea. Oswin didn't answer at first. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Didn't mean to," he said. "Most don't," the figure replied. "But it means to be taken." They stepped forward slightly, the long coat brushing against the undergrowth without a sound, and now Oswin could see the thin lines of their face, the odd stillness of their hands, the faint scent of something like rain on warm stone. "How long?" Oswin asked, surprising himself. "Will I carry it?" The figure tilted their head again, "Until it no longer recognizes you, or until you forget what your hands are for." That's not an answer. It's the only one it gives. Oswin shifted the sack slightly. It hadn't changed, not in weight or shape, but it felt more attentive now, as though it too was listening. "Do you want it?" he asked. "Is that why you're here?" The figure smiled, then faint and sad. "No, I've carried it. Long ago. Too long, perhaps. It leaves something behind, a kind of hollowness that echoes when you try to fill it with anything else." "Then why are you here?" Oswin asked. "To warn me?" "To remember," the figure said simply. "Each new carrier adds a memory, a layer, like rings in a tree. It never forgets its shapes, even as it reshapes those who hold it." Oswin stepped back, slightly wary now, not of threat, but of knowledge. "So you follow it?" The figure's smile faded. "No, I linger. There's a difference." They turned then slowly, and with no fanfare or farewell, stepped into the trees. Not vanished, just gone in the way smoke leaves a room gradually, but completely. Oswin stood for a moment longer, unsure whether he felt heavier or lighter. The path ahead was still narrow, still shadowed, but the forest seemed to have exhaled slightly, allowing him room to move again. He tightened the strap across his chest and walked on. Each step forward felt more certain than the last. Not easier, but chosen. Behind him, the light of dawn had begun to creep through the trees in threads. In front of him, the sack hummed its quiet rhythm again, and the path, as always, stretched on. And the path, narrowing, still opened, just slightly at the edges, where wild shrubs gave way to low stone walls and thin wooden fences too crooked to keep anything in or out. Oswin blinked at the sudden shift, not quite a clearing, but the slow re-entry into human presence where footprints lingered longer and the air smelled faintly of baked earth and dry hay. The buildings were modest, hunched low against the wind, their thatched roofs curled at the edges like old paper. He paused at the edge of the nearest lane, letting the quiet settle over him, not quite sure if the village was waking or watching. Smoke curled from a chimney across the way, thin and tentative, like someone testing whether the fire would behave this morning. No one was outside, but there were signs, boot prints in mud, a pail left beneath a drip, a child's toy carved from wood and abandoned beside a stoop, as if mid-play. Oswin adjusted the sack on his back, and it shifted with the same soft murmur it had held since he left. Not demanding, not silent, just there. The kind of presence that made its weight known in the way your own shadow reminds you that light can be broken. He walked slowly down the main path, boots muffled on mossy stones, and waited for someone to speak. No one did. But curtains moved ever so slightly, and the door of the bakery creaked open, just a thumb's width, before closing again with a soft thud. It wasn't fear he felt from them. Not precisely. More like acknowledgement, as if they had seen sacks like his before, or maybe carried one, or maybe simply chose not to ask about burdens that didn't concern their own shoulders. An older man finally appeared, bent over a broom that seemed mostly ceremonial in its effect. He swept the same square of dirt in front of what might once have been a general store, pausing only when Oswin's shadow fell across the space beside him. He looked up, eyes clear but tired. "You'll want to speak with May," he said, without prompting, not unkindly. "She's the sort who keeps a kettle on." Oswin nodded, unsure what else to offer, and the man resumed sweeping, not asking where Oswin came from, or why the sack seemed to breathe when the wind caught it just so. He passed a well that leaned slightly to the left, its bucket stained with moss, and followed the path to a narrow house with a sagging porch and a window full of hanging herbs. A bell above the door tinkled of its own accord before he knocked, and before his knuckles touched the wood, it opened. May was younger than he expected. Her hair shot through with gray, in that way people earned from early winters or late truths. She didn't speak right away, just looked at him, then the sack, then back again, her eyes softening with something that might have been recognition or regret. "You've come far," she said, and stepped aside. The room smelled of sage and drying apples, and the warmth inside was not from the hearth alone. Oswin entered slowly, unsure of the rules, but willing to observe. May pointed to a low stool near the fire and disappeared briefly into another room. The sack sat comfortably against his back, still quiet, still watching. When she returned, she carried a mug and a bowl of something thick and steaming, some mixture of oats and cream and finely chopped nuts. She handed him both without flourish. "You'll want to keep your strength up," she said. "They all do." Oswin didn't ask what she meant. He knew. Instead, he ate slowly, letting the heat settle into his chest, watching the way the flames bent toward the flue. "You knew I was coming," he said at last. "Not exactly," May replied, "but the path always points here before it bends again. Everyone passes through, one way or another." She didn't ask what he carried. She didn't ask where it came from. She only studied his face the way one studies a map, quietly tracking the roads it had traveled. "How long did you carry yours?" he asked her. Her gaze didn't falter. "Long enough to forget how I got it, short enough to remember who I passed it to." Oswin stared into his ugg. The sack still slung beside him felt a little warmer now, as if it liked being remembered. "Why don't people talk about it?" he asked. "Why act like it's not there?" "Because talking gives it shape," May said, "and shape gives it power. Most folk prefer their burdens vague, and their visitors temporary. We've all seen it. We just don't name it. But naming matters," he said. "Doesn't it?" May smiled, but it was a tired thing. Not to the sack. It already knows your name. Oswin didn't answer. He didn't need to. The fire crackled softly, the kind of sound that filled silence without asking for company. May sat across from him, sipping her own tea, now watching the way the flames leaned and the sack settled, and outside the village resumed its quiet choreography, its windows open just enough to breathe, its doors closed just enough to wait. The path would bend again soon. Oswin could feel it, Masson, and though May didn't say when he should leave, Oswin knew it the moment the fire gave a long, sighing snap, and the spoon in his empty bowl tipped sideways with a faint clink, as if giving him permission to stop pretending. Rest was rest. The warmth in her little home clung to him, a bit reluctant to release someone who hadn't yet begun to ache in earnest, but it did release him all the same. May didn't stop him. She simply gathered the bowl with the ease of repetition and placed it in a basin near the window where steam still painted faint stories on the glass. The path beyond town isn't marked, she said, not turning to face him. But the sack will know where to pull. Trust your feet, not your thoughts. Thoughts will lead you in circles. Oswin nodded, though she wasn't looking, and tightened the strap once more across his chest. The sack made no noise, no shift, but it felt steadier somehow, less an object, and more a companion. Not friendly, not hostile, but present in the same stubborn way a river insists on downhill. May handed him a small parcel wrapped in waxed cloth and bound with twine, the kind of thing one didn't open until it was needed. There's food in there. And flint. You'll know what for when it matters. He took it without thanks, not from rudeness, but because thanks would only make it harder to leave. Outside, the village watched as before, not unkindly, but with the quiet understanding that farewells were unnecessary when everyone eventually left. A child sitting cross-legged near a rain barrel looked up at him once, then down again, drawing circles in the mud with a stick. An old woman hanging dried onions paused long enough to nod more to the sack than to Oswin. The path beyond the last fence wasn't really a path. It was a suggestion, a direction offered in the tilt of trees, and the way certain stones seemed more worn than others. Oswin followed it, not because he knew where it led, but because his feet felt heavier when he stopped. The trees here were younger, thinner, but they leaned together in ways that suggested they remembered being forests and weren't quite ready to admit they'd grown apart. Birds called occasionally, but without urgency, just brief notes of presence, not warning. The sack adjusted slightly, with each step, a faint pull, guiding him away from flatter ground, nudging him toward hollows where the air cooled quickly and the moss grew deeper. Once, he thought he heard music, faint, plucked strings dancing on the breeze, but when he paused to listen, it vanished, leaving only the usual rustle of wind and the hum of unseen insects. Time did odd things on the crooked path. The sun didn't try or fall, so much as drift sideways, filtering through the trees like an afterthought, and Oswin found himself walking through a day that didn't behave like one. He ate once, opening the parcel, to find bread that hadn't gone stale, and slices of something smoked and patient. He chewed slowly, not because he was hungry, but because the rhythm of eating made his steps feel less like wandering. The flint stayed in its wrapping. The sack remained silent, content to let him carry it through places that didn't need names. By late, not quite afternoon, he reached a clearing where the wind moved differently, swirling in slow spirals that didn't match the direction of the grass. In the center stood a stone not tall, not carved, but placed, and Oswin knew without knowing that it marked something. Not a grave, not a boundary, a decision, maybe. A place where someone before him had set the sack down and stared at it for a very long time. He didn't stop. He nodded to the stone and stepped past it, and the sack rewarded him with a subtle easing of weight, just enough to notice, but not enough to tempt him into thinking he could let go. The trees thickened again, gnarled now, their trunks, wider roots, more tangled. Shadows came earlier, here curling between branches before the light had time to complain. Oswin felt the path tilt upward slightly. Not a hill exactly, more of a rise in the land's voice, like it had something to say, but wasn't sure if he was listening yet. He climbed slowly, the sack resting more against his back, now less of a pull and more of a lean. There was comfort in the weight, in the way it reminded him to keep moving. And somewhere behind him, though he didn't hear it, the wind changed direction. Just slightly. Just enough to mean something. The crooked path bent again, and ahead of him, a tree with roots like fingers wrapped around an old wooden signpost that had long since forgotten what it was pointing toward, and the wooden post, hugged tightly by the knuckled roots of the tree, bore no readable words anymore. Whatever it once proclaimed directions to distant hamlets, warnings about seasonal wolves, or maybe a cheerful "You are here" had long since faded beneath layers of moss and time worn smooth by wind rain, and the kind of silence that doesn't announce itself, but slowly takes everything. Oswin stood in front of it for a long moment, the way one might pause at a painting that almost stirs memory, but never quite speaks. He didn't try to decipher it. The sack didn't pull in either direction, merely sat against his back, with that familiar hum, like something listening inward instead of out. So he stepped past it, not left, not right, just forward. The trail, such as it was, descended slightly a winding slope, cushioned by leaf litter and broken twigs, soft enough underfoot that his steps made little sound. Birds called occasionally, but always from just out of sight. Never the same note twice. It felt less like traveling, and more like walking through the pauses between stories. The trees thinned again, after a time, opening into a dell where the grass grew tall and indifferent, brushing against his boots and knees like sleepy questions. In the center stood an old fence, broken in places, its posts leaning in conversation with themselves. Beyond it, a field that might once have been a garden, or perhaps never anything at all. A stone bench sat near the far side, slightly askew, its surface dappled with lichen, and the quiet work of many patient seasons. Oswin didn't sit, but he slowed. The sack oddly seemed to lighten here, not just in weight, but in presence, as if it too recognized the spot as a resting place, or at least a remembering one. He knelt briefly near the fence and ran his fingers along the wood, feeling the grooves left by old tools, old hands, old efforts to build something meant to endure. It hadn't endured, not really, but it was still here. That counted. The air had a softness to it, carrying the faint smell of dry herbs and old hay, and somewhere beneath it, the unmistakable hint of dust warmed by sunlight. It reminded him of the back corners of the village storeroom, the way the air shifted just before winter rations were unpacked. Comfort and caution mixed equally. He walked on. The sun, if it could still be called that, hovered in the sky, like it couldn't decide which way to move. Shadows stretched oddly, never quite matching the position of light, and Oswin began to feel the low ache in his legs that came not from effort, but from time passed too quietly. He reached into May's parcel again and found a handful of dried berries folded into cloth, their taste both tart and grounding. The act of chewing gave him a rhythm again, something to walk by, something to measure steps against. The sack shifted slightly as he moved, like it was resettling itself, and he didn't mind. It was part of the journey now, not a destination, not a goal, a companion of sorts, a quiet agreement between weight and will. Ahead, the trees grew strange, not twisted, but placed. Too evenly spaced, their branches, too symmetrical, the kind of pattern that nature rarely chooses without a little help. Carved into the bark of the first tree he passed was a symbol, nothing dramatic, just a small spiral with a line through it. He touched it lightly and felt nothing but age. The next tree held a different mark, and the one after that, another still, until it became clear he was walking through something. Not a forest, but a memory of order. A place someone once tried to shape. He wondered if they had succeeded. The sack pulsed once. Not alarmed, not even insistent, just enough to say yes. You're still paying attention. He kept walking, and soon the trees ended, or perhaps faded, giving way to a stretch of ground covered in flat stones set into the earth like stepping stools for giants. Moss clung between them, but the shapes remained visible. Old runes, maybe, or just fancy cracks. In the center of the stonework, a small pool reflected a sky that did not match the one above. Oswin paused at its edge and crouched. His face stared back at him, tired, dust-streaked eyes, a bit wider than they'd been. But behind his reflection was nothing but clouds, and clouds of a type he didn't remember seeing today. He reached out, not to touch the water, but just to hover his hand above it. The sack didn't move. Neither did the reflection. And for a moment, he saw something not in the water, but in his own shadow, a shape that wasn't his, a bend that didn't match the tilt of his head. He stood again slowly, and the shape faded. The path continued beyond the stone climbing once more, and he followed it. The trail narrowed, grown over now, with brambles and knee-high weeds that clawed at his boots like forgotten hands. But the sack guided him forward with quiet certainty, and his steps, though slower, did not falter. Not yet. Not here. Not with so much left unseen. And the whispering began almost too faintly to notice, tucked into the rustle of bramble leaves and the dry crackle of boot against stone. At first, Oswin thought it was just the wind, mischievous and toothless, curling between the overgrowth to tease his ears. But the cadence was wrong. Not natural, not random, but rhythmic. As if syllables were being carried, leaf to leaf, not loud enough to understand, but firm enough to feel. He paused only briefly, long enough to glance over his shoulder, where the path had narrowed behind him into a dense tangle that hadn't seemed so thick when he passed. The trees beyond it stood tall and aloof, unwilling to lean close enough to see what happened next. The sack pressed a little against his back, not with urgency, but with something like caution, as though it too understood the nature of this stretch. He took another step forward, and the brambles parted just enough to allow it. Not broken, not crushed, just accommodating. Their thorns curved inward, avoiding his cloak by inches, forming archways too precise to be accidents. The whispering continued, closer now, but not louder, and it didn't seem to come from ahead or behind, but from beside, within. A language he didn't speak yet. One his mind made room for anyway, like a song half remembered from childhood, heard through walls too thick to truly know. Oswin pressed onward, breath shallow, but steady, the rhythm of his steps syncing somehow with the muttering undergrowth. His hands remained by his sides, clenched only slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of not listening too hard. To listen too closely here, he suspected, was to hear your own voice answering back. The air grew heavier, not hot, but dense, thick with pollen, or perhaps just the weight of too many eyes that weren't eyes. The brambles rose taller now over his shoulders, their tips twitching occasionally, as if passing notes among themselves. Once the path twisted unexpectedly and led him into a clearing so small it felt like a pocket stitched into the side of the world. In the center stood a cairn, flat stones stacked neatly, each smaller than the one below. The kind of construction that suggested no hands had built it. Yet hands had certainly touched it. He didn't approach. The sack pulsed faintly again, and he understood. This was not a place to stop. He turned and found the path had shifted, now leading out in a direction he didn't remember entering from, and he followed it without questioning. The brambles gradually thinned their voices, tapering into silence, and the trees resumed their scattered posture, letting in the light, again gray and tired, but welcome. Oswin emerged onto a wider trail, one worn into the soil by generations of uncertain boots. He breathed more deeply now, but the whispering still hovered behind his ears, a faint echo that might not fade for some time. The sack, however, seemed lighter again, not physically, but in mood, as if it had passed through something it didn't enjoy, but endured out of necessity. Oswin looked back once, only to find the brambles already closed behind him. No trace of a path, no sign of movement. He tightened his grip on the strap. The trail ahead curved down through low hills, dotted with mossy rocks and gnarled trees that seemed caught mid-conversation. The quiet now was gentler, the kind of quiet that comes after something loud and strange, like the hush in a room after thunder. Oswin let it fill him, not with peace, but with permission to be alone again. A few birds called overhead, their songs short and unfinished, and somewhere in the distance a brook murmured its sound, too casual to belong to anything dangerous. He followed that sound, letting it draw him downward until he found the water, a thin, slow stream winding between stone banks, its edges frosted with early ice. He knelt beside it and drank, cupping the water in his hands and holding each mouthful a moment longer than usual before swallowing. The cold steadied him, cleared the whisper traces from his throat. He didn't rest long, just long enough to refill his skin flask and stare at his reflection, once more still, him still wary, but now with eyes that seemed older than the morning. The sack shifted again as he rose. Not heavy, not restless, just there. The way mountains are, there immovable and unbothered by the footsteps that cross them. He crossed the brook via a fallen log that creaked but held. On the far bank, the ground rose gently, and the trees opened into a patch of meadowland where grass grew high and swayed in unison, the wind finally finding its voice again. Oswin paused there, not to decide anything, just to notice. The sack felt very quiet now, as if waiting for something, or someone, or perhaps for the next part of the path to reveal itself. And the swaying of the grass was more than mere breeze. Each stalk bent not just with wind, but with purpose, as if taking turns to watch Oswin pass each movement, part of an old, slow conversation that had been going on long before he arrived and would continue long after he left. The meadow was wide, but not endless. Its borders were unclear, not marked by fence or forest, but by a gradual thickening of shade at the edges, as though the sunlight, while polite, chose only to attend the center. Oswin walked toward that center without reason. The sack didn't tug or pulse, didn't signal approval or warning. But it stayed warm on his back, a silent agreement that this was, at least for now, where he was meant to be. In the middle of the meadow stood a post. Not tall, not carved, just a weathered bit of timber set firmly in the ground, with a small ring of stones at its base, like the kind used to protect young trees or keep sheep from rubbing their backs raw. The post bore no message, no runes, no plaque, only age. And yet it felt watched. Not by the post itself, which had no eyes, but by the memory of those who had stopped here before. Oswin stood before it and took a breath, then another, the kind of breath one takes before kneeling at a well, not to drink, but to see what might echo back. The sack did not respond to the post, but it settled differently now, as if recognizing something it hadn't expected this soon. Oswin didn't touch the post. He circled it once slowly, feet pressing a faint path into the grass, and noticed how the wind inside the circle of stones moved differently, slower, more deliberate. He sat down, then legs crossed the sack, resting beside him, like a sleeping dog. Not quite relaxed, but not alert either. He didn't know why he sat, only that to stand too long would be noticed by something he couldn't name. The grass around him continued to sway, but not one blade bent toward the post, a respectful distance, like a crowd stepping back from a funeral pyre they didn't light. Oswin closed his eyes, just for a moment, maybe more. The weight of the sack against his side felt less like a burden and more like a boundary, something that reminded the world where he ended and it began. Behind his eyelids, the light danced in strange patterns, like sun reflecting off moving water. And within those patterns, images came, not dreams, not visions, just fragments. A hand reaching out, but not grasping. A voice calling a name he didn't recognize. A path that forked in 5 directions and then looped into itself. The memory of a bird's shadow passing overhead while no bird was seen. He opened his eyes again to find the post unchanged. But now the stones around its base seemed older, as if weather had suddenly remembered to age them. He stood slowly and picked up the sack. It was no heavier, but it clung more now, as if reluctant to leave. Not because of comfort, because of ritual. He stepped outside the circle, and the wind picked up, slightly brushing his cheeks with cool fingers that did not linger. The grass bent once more in unison, not in farewell, but in acknowledgement. The path resumed on the far side of the meadow, emerging from the thickest part of the shade, barely visible until he reached it. He walked on, and the sack adjusted again. No longer merely a presence, now something closer to a voice, with no sound. Something that knew he had paused, had watched, had been seen. The path narrowed through a stand of alder trees whose roots curled above ground like old hands resting on invisible knees. Their bark bore marks, some natural, some not. Letters, maybe. Names lost to time. But none of it slowed him. Not now. The meadow was behind him, but its silence stayed. A new silence, one that listened back, Oswin, and the silence that followed Oswin into the alder grove was not the hollow quiet of absence, but the full-bodied hush of memory, the kind that settles in old libraries and places where oaths were once spoken in earnest. Each tree he passed bore not just age, but posture slightly bowed, as though leaning in to listen to footsteps that echoed without sound. The path between them was narrow, cushioned by decades of fallen leaves and the steady work of worms. Oswin's boots made no imprint he could see, but he felt each step sink slightly more than it should, as though the ground recognized him and was taking a moment to remember who had walked here before. The sack clung to his back, its weight now strangely balancing, like it had found the rhythm of his bones and agreed to follow instead of lead. He did not speak. There was no need. The trees did enough speaking without sound, their trunks adorned with faint scars that might have been initials or symbols, or perhaps the shallow wounds of time brushing past them too closely. A crow called from somewhere above, once, then again, but never came into view. Its voice sounded more like commentary than warning, a brief note of acknowledgement before fading back into the leaves. At a bend in the path, the roots grew so thick that Oswin had to slow stepping carefully over the twisted gnarls that rose and fell like knotted ropes. Here among the roots, small objects had been left, stones arranged in tight spirals, a bit of cloth tied to a low branch, a wooden spoon set carefully in a hollow as though waiting for a meal that never came. Offerings, perhaps, or remnants. Oswin paused at one spiral of stones, kneeling beside it. He didn't know why, only that his hand moved of its own accord, reaching into the sack, not to pull something out, but to rest there, as though confirming that whatever this place was, the burden still belonged to him. The sack did not resist. It settled beneath his touch, and for a brief moment, Oswin thought he heard something like breath, but not quite the gentle exhale of something ancient and watching. He stood again and walked on. The path bent tighter now, curling through a dense stand where the trees grew close together, their branches weaving overhead like fingers laced in prayer. The light dimmed, slightly, filtered through the leaves into muted greens and grays that painted his face in patient shadows. There was comfort here, of a sort. Not warm, not gentle, but familiar, like the feeling of being remembered by a place you didn't know you'd visited. At a narrow crossing, a fallen tree served as a bridge over a dry gully, lined with smooth stones. Oswin crossed it slowly, the sack swaying gently with each step, and on the far side, the air changed, warmer slightly, not from sun, but from presence. The scent of wood smoke drifted in faint, but fresh. Someone was near. He rounded another bend and found a small hut nestled against the base of a hill, half covered in vines and moss, its roof patched with bark and old shingles. The smoke curled from a short chimney, straight and undisturbed by wind. Oswin approached with caution, not fear, and as he neared the door, it opened with a soft creak. An old woman stood there, barefoot, her gray hair pulled back into a braid that reached past her waist. She looked at him, then at the sack, and nodded. "Come in," she said, her voice like dry leaves and warm bread. "It's time for tea." He followed her inside without question, ducking beneath the low lintel. The hut smelled of cedar and herbs and something sharp vinegar, maybe, or the memory of something pickled. She motioned to a stool near the fire, and he sat the sack sliding down beside him with a thump that sounded more like a heartbeat than cloth. She didn't ask his name. She didn't ask what he carried. Instead, she poured tea into a small clay cup and handed it to him. "You've come far," she said, echoing May's words, but without repetition. "And you'll go farther still, but not without listening." Oswin nodded. The tea was hot, slightly bitter, but grounding. He held it in both hands. The old woman sat across from him, her eyes never quite meeting his, always just slightly to the side, as though watching something that hovered near him, unseen. "This place remembers," she said. "It remembers names and steps and pauses. You paused where many walk quickly. That matters." Oswin sipped the tea and said nothing. The fire popped gently. The woman's eyes moved once more toward the sack and then back to the kettle. "It's not the burden that changes you," she said, stirring something unseen into her cup. "It's how long you carry it, without asking why." He looked down at the sack. It didn't move, but he felt something inside him shift, not understanding, not yet, but readiness. The old woman smiled, not warmly, but with the kindness of someone who knows the road and won't tell you what's ahead. "You'll stay the night," she said, more a statement than invitation. "And tomorrow you'll follow the roots where they end. Not all paths are walked with feet." Oswin nodded again, and outside the wind began to change. Again. And when morning came, it arrived not with bird song or sunrise, but with the slow fading of the fire's glow and the gentle creak of the old woman's shutters being opened to a sky that had chosen a dull, permanent gray. Oswin woke, already sitting upright, though he couldn't recall falling asleep that way. The sack was beside him, not where he had left it, but close enough that it might have shifted during the night, just slightly, just enough to stay within reach. The old woman was already moving through her tasks, pouring water from a clay jug into a pot, brushing dried herbs into a pan that crackled even before it touched the heat. She didn't speak until he stood, and even then her voice was more of a continuation than a greeting. "The path isn't far, but it's hidden until you walk it. Like some truths." Oswin nodded, still heavy with that particular sort of sleep that clings more to the edges of thought than to the body. He rolled his shoulders, adjusted the sack, and took the cup of something warm and root-sweet she handed him, without question. The tea tasted like soil and nettle, and the edge of something bitter that would have been unpleasant had it not been brewed with such certainty. He drank it all. Outside, the air smelled of damp bark and slow-moving time. The hill that cradled the hut curved away into thick brush, its base crowded with undergrowth and fallen limbs. But the old woman didn't gesture toward any obvious trail. Instead, she knelt beside a mossy stone near her doorway, ran her fingers lightly over its surface, and whispered a word Oswin didn't quite catch. When she stood again, the moss had parted slightly, revealing a curl of bark, a spiral faint but deliberate, pressed into the stone's surface like a signature. She turned to him then. "Start where it ends," she said. "Let your steps feel for the root beneath the root. It knows the way." And with that, she returned inside, closing the door softly, the kind of goodbye that left nothing behind to echo. Oswin crouched beside the marked stone fingers, tracing the spiral. He didn't know why he did it, only that his hand moved with the certainty of a gesture performed before. Somewhere behind his thoughts, the sack stirred not physically, but in presence, as if leaning in, as if nodding. He stood and stepped off the hut's ledge into the brush, where the air changed almost immediately. The ground felt softer underfoot, though not wet, and each step brought a faint pressure against his boots, as if something below flexed gently in response to his weight. He didn't look for a trail. There wasn't one. Only thickets and gnarled limbs and patches of fern that didn't bother pretending they weren't watching. But he walked forward, each step slow and deliberate, until the brush gave way inch by inch to a corridor not marked by clearing, but by arrangement. Trees here leaned with purpose, their trunks bowed outward just enough to frame the way their roots forming ridges that curved in gentle patterns like ribs of something very old and very large, now buried beneath leaf and loam. Oswin stepped carefully between them, the ground rising and falling in slow rhythm. He realized after a time that he was no longer watching where to go. The way was simply there, unfolding underfoot, with a kind of patient logic. He only had to follow. The sack, now pressed more firmly against his back, felt settled in a way it hadn't before. Not relaxed, not ready to be rid of him, but content to move. Occasionally, he passed stones, half buried, ringed with lichen, some marked with spirals, like the one outside the hut, others with slashes or curls too faint to read. None seemed out of place. All felt like punctuation in a sentence too long to remember. The path sloped downward, eventually narrowing into a ravine where old water had once run the banks on either side, steep and shaded. He slid carefully down one side boots, finding hold in thick roots and packed leaves, and reached the bottom, where the air was colder and still. Here the silence was not absence, but concentration, the quiet of listening earth and watching trees. He walked slower now, not from caution, but from the sense that this place preferred stillness, that each footstep should be an offering, not a demand. Ahead, the ravine curved, and in the crook of its bend, he saw a shape. Not a hut, not a person. A stump, wide and flat, with something carved deep into its surface, an indentation smooth-edged and dark. Oswin stepped closer. The sack pulled slightly then, not sharply, but insistently. He knelt beside the stump and ran his fingers over the indentation. It was shaped like the sack's base, a perfect cradle carved not recently, but long ago, worn by time, but not forgotten. He didn't place the sack down, not yet. He only rested his hands atop it, feeling the hum of something old and quiet stirring. The air shifted slightly. Not wind, just awareness, as if something below had turned its face upward to listen. And as Oswin rested his hands atop the sack, the sense of being watched deepened, not from behind nor from above, but from within the hollow of the earth itself, as though something far beneath the roots and stone had stirred at the touch. Not alarmed, but aware in the way a sleeper turns their head when the rain changes tone outside the window. The indentation in the stump remained passive, waiting, unpressured, its shape so precisely matched to the sack that the thought of placing it there brought with it a weight Oswin hadn't yet known, a new kind of heaviness, not of burden, but of timing, of sequence of knowing, when a note must be struck in a song that has no score. He did not move for a long while. His knees pressed into the soft loam. Hands, steady eyes, half closed, not from sleep, but from the odd comfort of stillness. The wind above did not enter the ravine. The birds, if they were there, had chosen not to sing. Even the usual shift of small creatures in brush or leaf had paused, all leaning toward that central point where man and sack and memory met. Oswin drew in a slow breath. The sack's weight hadn't changed, and yet his arms now trembled slightly, not from strain, but from the awareness of how much had passed through this place before him. Not just other sacks or other carriers, but all the moments that brought them there. The long walks, the silences endured, the choices made beside unknown stones. And behind it all, the route that had guided his steps, not with words, but with shape, with path. He reached behind slowly, and unfastened the strap, feeling the sack ease away from him without resistance. It settled into his hands, heavy still, but no longer stubborn, as if it too recognized what must be done. When he lowered it toward the hollow in the stump, there was no sound, no shimmer, no sigh, just the soft contact of cloth meeting carved wood, like a book closing after its final page. The fit was perfect, and still nothing stirred. No light changed. But Oswin felt something shift, not around him, but in him. A quiet unwinding, like a rope no longer pulled taut. He remained kneeling, hands now resting at his sides, not because he was uncertain, but because the air told him this part was not his to finish. The stump did not glow, did not hum. But slowly, over long minutes, the ground around it began to change. Moss receded, slightly, drawing back like curtains. The soil near the roots breathed once, rising and settling. And from beneath the barest suggestion of warmth rose a deep, steady thrum felt in the bones, not the skin. Oswin watched, not for instruction, just to witness. Something beneath had acknowledged the return. The sack did not vanish nor open. It simply rested, now still, in a way it had never been while carried. A silence fell again, but this one felt earned. Not an absence of sound, but a fullness of it, the way a room quiets, not from fear, but from reverence. Oswin slowly stood. The air was thicker now, though not oppressive. Every leaf, every root seemed closer, not hostile, just present. The stump, the sack, the hollow beneath the ground, they would remain unchanged, but changed, waiting again. And Oswin would walk on. He turned from the stump without touching it again. His pack felt light now, the absence of the sack, noticeable not in pain, relieved, but in purpose, fulfilled. He adjusted the straps, breathed in, took one step, then another. The path behind him had closed, not violently, just gently erased, like ink soaked back into parchment. Ahead, a different trail rose narrow and lined with stones that had not been there before. They gleamed faintly, not with magic, but with the clean surface of things newly revealed. Oswin walked on. The roots beneath his feet no longer tugged, no longer whispered, but they followed, quietly, as always.